Hey, thanks for that reception. I would like to say welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming to what is the second in Oregon Humanities 2015 Portland Think and Drink series. My name's Adam Davis, and on behalf of Oregon Humanities, I just want to say we're really delighted that you're all here. Thank you for coming. We are especially delighted because we are joined in conversation this evening by Walidah Imarisha. So I want to say a big welcome and thank you. And we are going to jump into the conversation in just a moment. I want to thank a few folks and then ask you a few questions, short questions. You won't have to answer in long speeches or anything. First, I want to thank the Oregon Cultural Trust for helping make this event and many others like it possible around the state. Willamette Week was a media sponsor for this event, and then I want to thank 4 organizations that helped get the word out and I think get many of you here. And so that's the Oregon Historical Society, City Club of Portland, Portland State University's Black Studies Department. I want to see what happens with this last one, Bitch Media. Yes, that range of sponsoring organizations and supportive organizations I think already gives you some sense of the range of things that Walidah will help us think about tonight. The 2 questions I want to ask. First, if this is your first Oregon Humanities Think and Drink, can you give a signal in some way, either with your hand or make a little noise if it's your first one? All right, thank you. That was an interesting noise everyone agreed on. And then the second is maybe make a little noise if you're really comfortable or have a clear definition of the term visionary fiction. Okay, good. So we're going to have a lot to talk about tonight. That's good news. I want to, follow the visionary fiction mention by congratulating you, Walidah, on Octavia's Brood. A collection of science fiction with a rooted in and pointed toward social justice. And if I'm mischaracterizing it, I hope you'll help us characterize it accurately. And the first thing I want to ask to open things up, is related to this idea of visionary fiction, and especially the vision part of it. And then I was thinking about some work you've been doing around the state, including with Oregon Humanities, but particularly a program called Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? A Hidden History. So I was thinking about this idea of visionary fiction and then a hidden history and thinking about what's seen and not seen. And I wanted to just ask you, as we start off, as you come to this theater in Northeast Portland, what are you seeing? What do you think other people aren't seeing or might be seeing as they come into this place in this part of this town?
Yeah, I think we were talking about this backstage. It's really interesting to be on Alberta. I think I keep thinking of the old Alberta and expecting parts of that to be here, and it feels like a lot of that has not only been dislocated, but also just the history attempted to be erased. I think that's true for Alberta. I think that's incredibly true personally for me, for North Williams and Vancouver, because North Williams used to be the heart of the Black community here in Portland. You could hear jazz 24 hours a day. There were Black businesses in an incredibly racially segregated and overexploited and under-resourced community. Folks had created infrastructure, and to see North Williams as it is now, with how many condo projects going up and the New Seasons and boutiques and nary a face that looked like mine, I think that it really speaks to the huge shifts that have been happening here in Portland, which I think is endemic and representative of the rest of the nation. I don't know if folks saw the report. The Housing Bureau put out a report about housing costs that basically said that Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latino folks, poor folks, and single moms just can't afford to live in Portland at all. They had a little grid. I was like, this is a very clear grid, and it's a very depressing grid, because it said studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, and it said, it would say yes, and it'd be, I think, green, or no, red, and just no's, red no's all the way across for those communities. And so I think that for me, I do Oregon Black history. Oregon was, we could talk more about it. Oregon was founded as a racist white utopia. And I honestly think that that report is one of the things that shows that this mentality has continued unabated today.
And so that's a lot, we just dove right in.
That's how I do, y'all.
And maybe we can go a little deeper into different parts of what you said. And maybe start by going back. It's interesting thinking about a book of science fiction, looking forward, but you're also working around the state talking about history. And so maybe a little bit there, like Oregon was founded as a white homeland. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, I can.
I
feel a
bet you
little
can,
like
yeah.
I also feel like a little like LeVar Burton on Reading Rainbow, where he used to be like, and if you want to hear the rest of the story, you can find it at your local library. I'm like, feel free to come to an event or look up my YouTube video. But the idea behind Oregon was the creation of a racist white utopia, of a white homeland. And so in 1844, and there are many, many indications of this, I think one incredibly clear one that's very difficult to argue with is in 1844, when Oregon was still a territory, it passed its first racial exclusion law that banned black folks from living in Oregon. It also included the Lash Law, that said that black people would be publicly whipped every 6 months until they left the state. And so I think it's incredibly important to recognize that that level of blatant and brutal white supremacy and racism was about creating a racist white utopia. The idea was that white folks would come to Oregon and be able to build their ideal society away from the problems of the day, which in their minds they linked to the presence of people of color. And I think one of the things that's incredibly important about that shows that this is not just some long dead history, but this is something that walks with us every day, is that racial exclusionary language wasn't removed from our Constitution until 2001, right? So until 2001, our Constitution banned black folks from living in Oregon. It was the only state in the Union to have a racial exclusionary clause in its Constitution when it was admitted to the Union. And to be clear, in 2001, it was a fight to get that language removed. It passed by the slimmest of margins. So again, I think that while, especially Portland would like to tout itself as this sort of, liberal paradise, I think that what it does is show that oftentimes liberalism is deeply rooted in white supremacy. I'm like, welcome, y'all, welcome.
So there's this phrase that shows up in your co-editor's story in Octavia's Brood, just because you're talking about Portland and liberals, where she describes one of the characters describes hipsters and entrepreneurs as complicated locusts.
Yeah.
Well-intentioned, but trying to grab everything up. Complicated locusts, which is a pretty great phrase. It's hard to get it out of your head once you come across it. Can I just ask, do you grow up in Oregon?
I didn't. I grew up on military bases, actually. So I grew up mostly overseas in Iceland and Germany, and then moved to go to part of high school in Springfield, Oregon. Y'all. Talk more about that if you like.
I think we would. In a way, what I'm trying to ask a little bit about the sort of out there, the laws on the books, the experience out there, and the experience for you. And so, what was that like moving to Springfield and growing up a certain point from a certain age here?
Yeah, I think the title of my program, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon, certainly came from my experience of walking out my door and being like, what have y'all done here to your black people? And, growing up on military bases, the military disproportionately recruits in communities of color. So the places I grew up, when we lived on base or I went to base school, was predominantly people of color. So I grew up in communities that were predominantly people of color. So to move from that environment to Oregon was a huge shock. And I was lucky enough to take a class with Dr. Darren Milner when I got to Portland State, right? Who knows who Dr. Milner is? Mad props. And so got to learn some of that foundational history, and definitely it sort of changed the course of my life. So.
Why stay, why come to PSU, that sort of thing? I think I'm asking a little bit about both the other side, like what keeps you in Portland, Oregon, that sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have a very crass reason for why PSU, because they gave me enough money to go to school, and we didn't have money to pay for it otherwise. So I was like, I would rather go to, my dream was Howard University, but yes, I'm jealous. But I was like, I gotta go where I can actually fund education, which is, the costs are astronomical and continuing to rise. And I actually, after I graduated, went to Philadelphia, and honestly, I was like, peace, Portland, I'm never coming back, see ya, right? So, and I was in Philadelphia for 8 years, and when I told people I was moving back, folks thought I was kidding, my friends who were still here. They're like, oh, you're so funny. I'm like, no, I'm moving back. They're like, kidder. I was like, no, I'm moving back. And they're like, but you said. I was like, don't throw my words back in my face. So I have since learned, don't make declarative statements like I am never going to, because you will look like an ass later. But I came back because, despite, I think, a lot of very deeply rooted issues for me in Portland, this is where I feel like I've been able to make incredibly strong community. I think one of the things, especially doing this Oregon Black History work, that has inspired me and humbled me and has made me want to stay and add to this legacy of resistance is the ways that the Black community and other communities of color have resisted. There should never have been Black communities in Oregon at all, right? According to the law that said we would be publicly whipped every 6 months until we left. And 124 people heard that. 124 Black folks heard, we will whip you until you leave. And they said, I'm not leaving, so what are you gonna do? And I think that there is, as PSU Professor Karen Gibson talks about, an unbroken, continuous thread of resistance through the Black community in Oregon. And I think that it's an incredible honor to learn about that and to try and protect and preserve that history so other folks know about it as well.
Great. So you use the phrase, make strong community. I just want to ask, that seems to be one of the things you do. It's interesting preparing for this and looking at all the things you've been doing, all the things you do, the way your work runs in many directions, but it seems like you make strong community. And I want to ask how you do that, and if your understanding of how to do that has shifted.
I don't know. I'm glad it looks like that from the outside. I think it's always, it's a complicated, thing. But I think that when I moved back from Philadelphia, I was very clear that if I was moving back to Portland, I had to be very intentional about the community that I created for myself, so that I had the level of support and care to hold my spirit and my heart going through what is an incredibly hostile environment, and is more hostile to folks of color because it won't admit that it's hostile, right? In some ways, being in Philadelphia, I actually, when I moved there, I lived in many different parts, and I ended up moving across, in North Portland, in North Philadelphia, across the elevated train, which I didn't know. You did not cross the L if you were brown. And on the other side of the L, it was all white. And I was called the N-word pretty much every day walking to the train and coming home. And then one evening I came home to my house and there was a swastika carved onto my house. And I was like, you know what? God bless Rosa Parks. That is not me. I'm out. I'm not trying to integrate y'all. Like, you stay here and be crappy with each other. I gotta go. So, you know, and I mean, this wasn't that long ago. This was in, I think, 2005, right? So, you know, I think in some ways, you know, it was easier that it was up front, and it was clear where folks stood. And I think that, unfortunately, Portland often deludes itself and tells itself stories that it wants to hear. Now I'm just talking mess about Portland and not answering your question about building community.
They may be related. I mean, those two things may be related. But I do think you are speaking to the question. I think, I mean, you said, God bless Rosa Parks, that's not for me. Something you said, but your work is very much in that tradition. And I think I want to ask, I think what I'm trying to ask really is about what you're doing that you feel like is having an effect, is helping people see what they don't want to see, and maybe even work on it, but maybe even just start with that. And I'm thinking especially about things like touring the state, going to all parts of this state and putting tough news in front of people. How does that feel, and what sort of effect do you think it has?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things about, and it's not just this moment, but I think it's kind of sharply highlighted right now, is around how marginalized and oppressed groups deal with institutionalized oppression, and I mean, a system that is rooted in oppression. And so, you know, I think that there's definitely been this concept of a politics of respectability, which has been talked about a lot, especially in the context of the Black community and Black organizing, which is also the politics of assimilation, right? Assimilate into the system, accept the rules of this dominant white culture, play the game, and you might be allowed to win, right? And I think that there's another strain of saying we don't actually want to integrate into an oppressive structure. My goal is not to get access to a structure that is oppressing other folks. My goal is to build alternative structures that are rooted in community, rooted in visions of new just worlds. And so I actually see, my hope is that all of my work connects with that. And so, you know, I very much think that that idea of the past, the present, and the future, right? I mean, I'm gonna nerd out for a minute, you guys.
Oh, go, yeah.
Because, you know, I think in Western thinking, it's this very linear progression. It's very much, you know, the past, the present, the future. You move through it, you can't go back. Not everybody has thought that way. And in fact, now physicists are like, so the way we talk about time is totally incorrect, guys. Time is relative, right? But we don't actually get taught that in school. So folks are like, you just blew my mind. What? Time is not absolute. So I really think of an Ndingra symbol, which is a West African cultural symbol of the Sankofa. And the Sankofa is a bird that is moving forward, but it's facing backwards. And I actually think of that as the most powerful subversion of the idea of Western linear time, that this bird is living in the past, the present, and the future all at once, that it's not something that's separate out into these neat little boxes, that recognizing they're all intertwined, they're all intersecting and interacting with each other all the time. And so for me, my work of reclaiming these histories, of showing starkly the ways that racism and oppression has been institutionalized, not just in Oregon, but in this nation, and then saying, and there have always been folks who resisted that. For every second of repression, there were immense acts of resistance that have occurred from the very beginning. And we have to hold both of those, because otherwise we end up seeing oppressed people as passive victims rather than active change makers. And so that's the work that I feel like leads into the present that I'm living and trying to build, which is also fluid into the futures that I dream about as well.
What's it been like to be in Grants Pass, to be in different parts of Portland, to be out east, and try to get people to look squarely at Oregon's history and its present with an eye to a different future. How has that been as an experience for you?
I think that I'm incredibly glad that I have engaged. I started with Conversation Project doing a program on alternatives to incarceration 6 years ago. And I got to go to prison towns, and I got to speak with wardens and prison guards who came to the events, as well as the former head of the Oregon Department of Corrections. And by and large, most of them, not all of them, agreed with the analysis that prisons, if the function of prisons is to keep us safer and to make our communities more whole, prisons are not serving that function, right? And I think that it was really powerful for me to do that, because I think a lot of times what we're told is that mainstream America, which means middle-class white people, right? I'm like, could y'all just say what you mean? Because, aren't ready to talk about race, aren't ready to talk about prisons, aren't ready to talk about all of these, provocative issues. And having toured around Oregon and engaged in, a vast majority of the rural communities, I don't think that's the reality. I overwhelmingly, especially for the Oregon Black History Program, the rooms are packed because there are so few places where folks are getting to have conversations about race and racial justice. So what I think it speaks to me is that there is a desire to do that more spaces need to be created, and honestly, that white folks need to be going out and doing that work, especially. That white folks have to talk to other white people. And I think that, I think a lot of times there's what I used to call, when I was doing hip hop organizing, the down ass white boy, right? Like that dude who's like, yeah, I like kick it. I don't even hang out with white people, man, I can't stand them. I'm like, so that's not helpful to me at all. Because who I'm gonna have to talk to is those people you don't kick it with, and they don't wanna hear from me. So, I think that it's really, and I think that this has been a historic, we see again and again in organizing for social change that, oftentimes, white, progressive, radical organizers don't want to go into these communities. And again, we see that actually, the most transformative work that is happening is when white folks go in and have these hard conversations. That's happening in white communities, let's be clear, because in communities of color, we got this. We're doing our thing, right? We don't need saviors. But is going in, and I think that there are, incredible examples historically of, during the civil rights movement, right, that we often talk about these white folks who joined, and supported black-led leadership, which is important. But the work we don't hear about is the folks who are going into these communities, right, these Klan-controlled communities, and doing anti-racist union organizing there, right, or going in and doing this grassroots, anti-racism training for the long haul, right, and dealing with immense pushback. And so I think that that's incredibly important for white folks to commit to doing. It's not fun, it doesn't make you feel cool, and oftentimes it's that kind of thing when someone says something horrific and you're like, oh my God, how could you say that? And then there's that party that was like, and a year ago I would have said that, right? And that, I think that's the part that white folks don't want to confront, their own growth areas, let's call them. But, I think in terms of, I always feel like when I do these events, white folks say, well, what can we do? And I feel like, go talk to other white folks about this, not just once, in an ongoing way, in a way that, holds folks accountable and is principled, but opens the door for continued conversation. And support the leadership of people of color, because again, we don't need saviors, we need allies, right? Folks of color have been active change makers. The organizing that people of color have done in Portland, in Oregon, has made the entire state so much better for everyone here, right? And so when people of color take leadership, they actually create institutions and ideologies that make our entire communities wholer, safer, and more healthy. So I think that sometimes white folks get into this scarcity, like, if we support you, then we're gonna, be taking the back seat. And the reality is, when we look at the institutions that folks of color create to serve their needs that are not being met by these dominant systems, they enrich the entire community.
So what you're talking about, as I'm listening to it, actually sounds in many ways unsurprisingly complicated. Complicated in part because different conversations, or at least different places that people ought to be having conversations first and foremost. And it makes me think of a phrase, again, from one of your essays, but you say that post-racial fantasies are themselves racist. And so then, that occurs to me now because the challenge seems to be how to, on one hand, be very aware of the ways that racist policy and entrenched racist attitudes are still affecting things, and yet how to proceed forward. I think the complexity then is like, okay, should I only talk to people who look like me? Where should I go that's comfortable to go? I not only hear you, but I agree so deeply with what you're saying about the savior image. And then it's a question, then how do you feel going into, say, white communities? Does it feel like in some way that's a version of that, or no?
A version of what?
A version of going, I need to help these people.
No.
No. Here's what I'm asking also with the story your story in Octavia's Brood, where the angel is, the image in there is really beautiful, the image of singing people's pain away, but absorbing it. So I think that's part of what I'm trying to ask about in an unclear way.
I like unclear questions, because then I can do whatever I want. So it's great.
How about it?
I mean, I think the racial power dynamics are incredibly, different. And, I chose to go into, to apply to Oregon Humanities Conversation Project. I chose to develop specifically a program about the history of, race and identity in Oregon. I chose to accept every, rural event that came across my desk. It wasn't like y'all came in my house at night and suddenly I woke up in Bend and I was like, I guess I have to do this event, right? Like I chose to do all of those. So, I think that, I think it's important that I definitely feel like one of the roles that I hope to embody as well as I can is around, the term educator, I feel like I think it's more about providing tools and resources that have been purposely kept from folks, and presenting those and trying to take information that has been locked away and fling open the doors and be like, come on in, y'all, look at all this stuff, look at it, like, yeah, pick it up, go ahead, right? Break the museum glass and be like, yes, pick it up. So, that's a decision I've made for myself, and, so I think that's a decision folks make for themselves, and I accept, the repercussions of that. But, I think it's important to recognize that, that every Black person is not in the role of educating white folks, right? And I'm like, so, if you got folks, feel free to send them to my event. That's my job. So, but I think it's important to create those spaces. I think it's important for those spaces to be clear and intentional. I think it's important for the folks of color in those spaces to have consented to be there and to be being compensated and supported to be there as well. And I think that those spaces need to be utilized, rather than what often happens of, expecting people of color to do white folks' work for them. When I'm like, you could Google that. Like, there's this awesome thing called the internet, and folks of color have written a lot of books. You should check them out because some of them are real good. So I think it can't take the place of folks doing their own work.
Okay.
But that my goal is to provide a sort of starting place for folks who are interested in doing that in that space and capacity.
Thank you for a good answer to a bad question, for starters, or an unclear question. You talked about tools before, and you talked about your work. And one of the interesting things in preparing for this was, again, journalist, poet, founder of a couple magazines, community organizer, historian. What's the shorthand for what you do in the world that you provide?
I don't know that there is a shorthand. I'm like, I don't know, I do stuff. So I'm really articulate about it. I think again, I think that I've always kind of been interested in many different things, and I think that for a while it was difficult because I sort of felt like, well, these are different things and I have to keep them in separate boxes. And I think that actually doing Octavia's Brood and engaging with this idea of envisioning new futures, dreaming new futures, and what would those look like, and how do we create the most just futures possible, and recognizing that one of the ways to do that, and learning that from incredible organizing work happening on the ground, is to center those folks who have been marginalized, those folks who live at the intersections of identity, centering queer and trans folks of color, centering young folks who are dealing with ability and access issues, undocumented immigrant, queer youth, recognizing that when we center folks who live at the intersections of all these identities and oppressions, then liberation has to be whole. It has to be total liberation. It can't just be piecemeal, because the question becomes, well, which is more important? Your oppression as a queer person, your oppression as someone dealing with ability issues, your oppression as a person of color, your oppression as a young person? And folks are like, are you seriously asking me this right now? Right? And the reality that all of those add up, right? They're not just these separate things we walk around with, they create a whole. And so I think that doing that work, both in organizing and then in dreaming these new worlds, has been really powerful personally, because I feel like I've been able to kind of unite my own kind of fragmented self and say, no, it's not that I'm just, not able to focus on anything, as my mother might have said, but that really I'm all of these issues are interlocking, and that these issues are the ones that speak to me and feel like they go organically. And also recognizing that, like I said, for me, many of this is about exploring the same ideas and visions through different mediums. And so really, as a poet, as someone who supports folks doing art, recognizing that art isn't just like, oh, isn't that some interesting thing over there, and now let's get back to the real world. But like, for me, art is another way of knowing, in a way that is just as valid as, scholarly essays and research and, and information and journalistic reports. Art is also a way of knowing, a way of understanding the world, a way of gaining information and expressing new visions. And I think that it's important for it to be held up and honored in that way as well.
Well, that makes me think of the lines which I think it's from Octavia Butler, the lines near the end of the book. I think it's, there is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was one, y'all. So who here loves Octavia Butler? All right, y'all have to make some noise. So that was from her unpublished book, Parable of the Trickster, which was supposed to be the third book in the Parable series, Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, Parable of the Trickster, which she never actually got to finish. She tried, and she just couldn't figure out how to make it work. But that was one of the parables in it that she wrote for her main character, that there's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. And, I feel like that is just such a powerful, powerful idea that Octavia left us with.
I agree, powerful, and also it hasn't left my head since I read it, and so I've been thinking about it, and I think that there is something really magnetic about the image and also something that's daunting, which is that the thing about the stuff that's new under the sun is that we seem to have more control over it. And the challenge about the sun is that it's a given. And it crystallizes for me the challenge that I think you're putting in front of us, which is we're not talking about changing one thing. We're talking about huge change. So in a way, I want to ask, with what you said about tools before, how do we know if we're making progress towards that kind of wholesale change? How can we sort of gird ourselves for change of that size in concrete ways?
I mean, I think one of the things that is powerful about that piece by Octavia is really also saying, you know, she doesn't say, but there is another sun. She says there are new suns, multiple. And I think that's something we've really tried to embody with Octavia's brood, is not finding the right answer, right? There are many paths to liberation, to change, to new just worlds, as there are human minds that can dream them up, right? Or alien minds, robot minds, whatever minds, sentient minds, to dream them up. And so I think that's one of the principles and values that I think Octavia really held and left us with, is that, you know, there's not one right answer, that together we will try things, we will come up with multiple things. My co-editor Adrian always says, you know, this is our opportunity to practice yes and rather than no but, right? That a lot of times in our lives, in our organizing work, it's no, that's not going to work. No, but you didn't think about this, so that's why I'm right. And she says, you know, during our workshops, during this work, and just in the work she does in the world, we need to practice yes and. Yes to that idea, and here's how I'm adding on to it. Here's how we're building together collectively. And so I think that's something that Octavia really embodies in her work. And I think that third book, Parable of the Trickster, even though it wasn't released, there have been a few articles about the content. And so, you know, Parable of the Sower is set in a slightly futuristic world that's horrific. Things are just a little bit worse, and they're terrifying. And basically, this young woman's entire life is destroyed, and she basically has to go out into this hostile world and with just a vision for a new world and try to build it. And one of the things she wants is for Earthseed, which is what she calls her community, to take root among the stars, right? Her idea is that humans will escape this planet and go to the stars. And so Parable of the Talents, which is the second book, shows how folks do that. And many people, myself included, at the end of Parable of the Talents were like, oh, that's the end? It feels a little... And when I found out that it was supposed to be a trilogy, I was like, yes, the brilliance of Octavia Butler knows no bounds. Because in all of the versions, and she wrote like 500 pages of it, but she just kept writing the beginning over and over and over again because she couldn't get it right in her head. And what happens is they go to the stars, right? These humans go to the stars and they find out, oh, just going to a different planet doesn't actually change the issues we have. And we will reconstruct the same oppressive structures that we were running away from unless we decide to do something different. And I was like, yes, that's what I wanted at the end of Parable of the Talents. Like, really? Just going somewhere else is gonna fix our problems? But Octavia's saying, no, there's nothing new under the sun. Going to a new place will not make us new. But there are new suns, which means there are new ideas and ways of interacting with each other that we can choose. We can make different choices every time we encounter a new sun. It's ours to choose. I was like, I could talk about Octavia all day, y'all. I was like, rein it in.
I mean, deciding something different. I'm thinking about myself and how entrenched I am in what I think is right, and how hard it is to decide something different. And I guess I wonder, in your work, if you've seen tools that are especially effective at getting people to move to a place where they can decide something different, or even if there are specific examples you can think of.
I mean, I think for us, it's really about holding shared values and principles, right? And I think, when you say those actual values and principles, there are very few people who argue with you, which is why the right says things like, we believe in family values. And it's, I'm like, so who is going to stand up and be like, it's really the family I hate, right? Like, I just hate people who have formed connections with each other and made commitments to support one another. I just hate that, right? Maybe someone will, but most of us, and they've hijacked the idea of what family means, obviously, right? They're like, this is what the only image of what family looks like, right? But actually, only 20% of families look like this, heteronormative, white, patriarchal, family with the mom, the dad, the 2 kids, the picket fence, right? The dog. Like 80% of our communities, our families, don't look like that. 80% of our families are so-called deviant, right? So I think if, for me, I'm like, I'm reclaiming family, and I consider family people who are blood, and I consider some blood folks not family, right? And I consider some, folks who other people call friends family, and so on. And so I think some of it is about talking about those values and principles and getting at what's underneath, right? Because I think that a lot of times people are like, oh, that's what that means, because I've been told again and again and again that's what that means. And really getting folks to question, well, is there another idea? Is there another way? Are there infinite other ways that could exist? And I think that's one of the things that's great about science fiction, is science fiction, demands that you throw out everything that you think you know and start with the question, well, what story are you going to tell me? Like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what the rules and the laws are of this. And so that's something we've really tried to do, not just, we put out the anthology, but we've developed numerous workshops that we do in connection with the anthology, writing workshops, organizing workshops, poetry workshops, envisioning different futures workshops, to really get folks to question that. Because, Ursula Le Guin, who spoke at the National Book Awards a few months ago, she had a great conversation where she was saying, people think things like capitalism are inevitable, that capitalism must exist forever, that's all we have, it'll go on forever. And she was like, you know what else people thought would exist forever? The divine right of kings. You know what doesn't exist? The divine right of kings, right? I was like, Ursula Le Guin comes so hard. She was like, I don't have time to play around, y'all. And she said, that movements for social change need writers. They need people who are courageous enough to envision new worlds. And I believe that's all of us. I think that all of us have the capacity and ability to envision new worlds, and to, as long as we're starting not with what we think we know, but really being open to saying, are there other ways of thinking about it? Is there something beyond the divine right of kings? Is there? I don't know, right? And then it's like, bam, there it is. It only exists in Game of Thrones.
Which seems like an incomplete solution. I'm thinking about the new worlds being envisioned, and what you said early in our conversation about coming here. And I guess I want to ask, on the whole, do you feel hopeful about our capacity, our collective capacity, to move past the challenges we have given ourselves?
I do. I don't know any organizer who's not hopeful, right? Because why would you choose to do community-based organizing if you don't actually believe that change is possible? Even if it's your job, you can find better paying jobs with way better hours, right? So I think that, even when folks are feeling cynical and burnt out, folks are hopeful that change is possible. And so, I absolutely believe that. I think that it's going to take incredible amounts of work. I think that it's going to take incredible amounts of destabilization of folks' lives, internally, externally, physically, mentally, spiritually, in every aspect. And I think that it is something that is going to be a long haul, and the yes and I think, and it's something that we can begin manifesting right at this moment, right? The future can live right now. We can be building those relationships, those communities, those kind of interactions, embodying that new just world that we want to see, we can be doing that right now and engaging in some awesome time traveling at the same time. I'm in the past, I'm in the present, I'm in the future. And so I think that, I think that in terms of institutionalized change, which is absolutely something that has to happen, that may be that's a long haul.
Yeah.
And I also think it's important to recognize that oftentimes change happens very quickly, right? That folks have been working on this, holding this space, moving this work forward, and in a matter of a few decades, things shift dramatically. And so I really don't like those organizers who try to motivate folks and say, like, we won't see this change in our lifetime, maybe not even our children's lifetime, but we have to keep struggling, and you have to give everything to the cause, and you have to do it with gratefulness that you get to struggle. And I was like, ooh, that's not a good advertising pitch, Bill. I think, yes, absolutely, we're going to have to struggle, we're going to have to sacrifice, we're going to have to put in work. And we have to remember the joyous parts of it as well. We get to build community. We get to be part of this legacy, right, of change and of visionary action and organizing. I mean, for Adrian and I, we're both Black women, and so for us, the image of enslaved Black folks is incredibly powerful, right? Because enslaved Black folks were told that freedom was impossible. Slavery would never end. They were told that the best they could hope for was a little bit of reform, a kinder, gentler slavery. And those enslaved Black folks rejected that entirely. And they said, well, if you're telling us freedom is impossible, then we will make the impossible a reality. We will change and break this entire world if necessary to get our freedom and to get the freedom of those who come after us. And they did exactly that. And so I think that that's, for me, incredibly important to hold on to. Those folks, as sci-fi creators, I was like, there is nothing more powerful than what y'all did. You dreamed of freedom at a time when it was the most alien sci-fi vision possible, and you made it happen. You built it into existence. You made me happen. And I have the right and the responsibility and the privilege to be part of that lineage and carry that work forward.
I think what I want to do is I want to open the floor, the mic to questions, especially given where you just left us. So the way this is going to work is we have a microphone, I believe it's to our left. I can kind of see it, and we'd probably like to get a line going back towards the exit sign so that you're not blocking people behind you. And as people work their way up there, I guess I just want to say a preliminary and large thank you to Walidah for getting us started this evening. So thanks so much.
I guess I'll open the floor then. All right. My name is Darren. I came a little late. I apologize. But you just put on a point that kind of made me think about it. You say that slaves were never told they would never be freed, to whereas they would never see the end of slavery. It would only be reformance of it. Well, don't you feel like that is what the current U.S. government or the current society structure that we're in right now is doing? I mean...
Bam.
I mean,
you were like, I just dropped the mic on that one.
No, I don't mean it like that, but I mean,
yeah.
For what I mean is how can we directly affect that mode? Like, how can we break that part?
Yeah.
Like, how can we get that there?
I mean, I think that that's an incredibly important point that you're bringing up, and I think that it's absolutely important to recognize, as a poet, I actually did, my first chapbook was called Children of Ex-Slaves, An Unfinished Revolution, because I think that, that work of ending legalized slavery was not finished, right? It wasn't finished in that, and part of the other work that I do is around prisons, is around alternatives to incarceration, right? That, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was written with a loophole.
Right.
It says, that slavery is abolished except in the case of punishment. And that we see the in the first enormous boom of the prison population happening after the 13th Amendment is passed, after the end of the Civil War. And we see prisons going from being overwhelmingly white to overwhelmingly black in the course of a few years in this country, because that was about the reinstitution of enslavement, about capturing black folks, utilizing them for free labor, oftentimes in the South on the same plantations where they were enslaved a few years earlier, right? That across this country, there were things created called the Black Codes, right? Especially in the South, which were laws that criminalized behavior only for black people. So it was illegal not to have a job only if you were black. It was illegal to congregate on the corner with more than 3 folks if you were black, right? Which is still basically a law.
Still in LA.
Right.
Still in LA.
Everywhere, right? That it was, how did they say it? It was illegal to act in a lewd or wanton manner if you were black. I was like, I don't even know. I mean, obviously these laws were created to be so vague that, any black person could be swept up into it, right? And so I think that what's important and what's useful in the context of thinking about the Black Codes and the establishment of the prison industrial complex in that time period is to recognize that it was not actions that were criminalized, it was identity. Blackness was criminalized, free blackness was criminalized, and that continues today. So folks are sitting in prisons right now not for what they've done, but for who they are. And I absolutely think that that connection to slavery is important, and I'm sure many folks have read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. I hope folks read books like Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete?, Ruthie Gilmore's The Golden Gulag. There are incredible works that show that this is part of the continuation. And I think the other piece that's really important is something that Angela Davis talks about, raising up W.B. Du Bois's point around abolition democracy. Right, that he talks about, we talk about slavery was abolished. And actually W.B. Du Bois said, so abolition is not a vacuum, it's not a negative, it's the presence of justice, right? That kind of MLK quote that, what is it? Peace is not the absence of violence, it's the presence of justice. And so W.B. Du Bois said that for abolition, right? That until enslaved black folks got justice, got economic justice, social justice, political justice in this country, that we didn't abolish slavery, right? That we never actually fulfilled the requirements of abolition. And so I think that that's a really important point too. And, right, the yes and, I think it's absolutely important to celebrate the work that has been done, the incredible, fearless, courageous, death-defying work that enslaved black folks did. I will not take away from everything that they did and say, well, slavery continued, so you didn't actually do anything, right? That we have to celebrate our victories. We have to celebrate our wins, recognizing, yes, the work continues, because the work will always continue. But we have to find ways to celebrate, to honor, and to continue that resistance in joy. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Tiffany, and as you know, and my question is kind of twofold. It was amazing because you were talking about being within the communities and being able to speak to other people and educate white folks and as well. And it's like, how do you, if you're within the system, I think of me and my colleague is here tonight, and where we are, we're the only 2 people of color on our executive floor in our organization. And of course we share an office because we have to keep all the power in the same place. And it's, working where we do in the executive floors, there's a lot of conversation and good old boy conversation that we get to be privileged to hear / endure. And when it's mentioned, and sometimes you were sitting there, and I remember one time we were in a meeting and things were said that were just, you can't believe this is actually being said in 2000 anything. And my coworker actually, she's like, sit down, that's such and such, you want a job tomorrow, be quiet. And I remember bringing this up to my director later on, and I just said, she's like, well, do you ever feel like victimized working here? And I said, it's amazing that these things are said, and I'm not in a place to be able to speak to it, but no one else here does either. Mm-hmm. And the response I received, which was actually earlier this year, was that don't you think that nationally, when I look at things, that it seems like you people have an increased sensitivity right now?
Anything that starts with you people.
Right, and I know, and I'm not meaning to offend, but of course, educate me. But I guess, are there resources for those of us who, I need to be in my organization where I'm at because they need me. They need to be represented by me. I can endure the "you're not like everybody else" comments, but you're different. But where do we do? How do I bring about active change? Because there's a part of me that dies every day because I feel like I'm failing to educate, and I'm denying half of myself to exist and provide for my family. So what do I do?
It's rough. I'm glad that you have colleagues, and I hope that you are taking care of your heart and your spirit as well externally, finding support, finding those folks who you can be like, girl, let me tell you what happened today, right? Because you have to get that out. I also think, when they make you share the office, right, there's like, we're trying to contain the power, but, that's also where you can foment rebellion as well. You're like, well, we right here, so let's just, we don't have to make an appointment, we right here. And can't nobody hear us because we in our office. So, I think some of it is thinking about how to subvert it. What I said before as well, I don't feel like it's a responsibility of every single person of color to educate white institutions, individuals, organizations. I think that would be, that would drain, we would be little desiccated raisin, like the California raisins, like very quickly if you try and do that constantly. And I think, again, that's actually a perpetuation of white supremacy, is to say, I don't actually have to do any work. You just sit there, give me all the information, defend your existence, defend your experiences to me, and I'll decide whether it's valid or not, right? That's actually just allowing white supremacy to function as usual in this very sort of clever, liberal racism way, right? Where it could be, and honestly, Portland is very good at this, right? I always say, Portland will listen you to death, right? They love their listening circles. Tell us more, right? And what it does is it drains people of color. It makes us vulnerable, right? Because you have to open yourself up. Again, you have to defend your existence. And at the end of the day, there aren't avenues for that to cause institutionalized change. So this is all me trying to sound really smart, but being like, I don't know, because I've been in the same situations in these white institutions, and I think that for me, what I do is really try and focus my energy and decide where it will be best spent, and also make sure that I'm doing work that feeds not only my spirit, but communities of color, and specifically the Black community, that I'm not giving all my energy to these oppressive white institutions that may or may not in any way change because of it, but really saying, and how do I take energy and give it in spaces where I actually feel like it is heard, acknowledged, respected, and celebrated as well. So that's not a very good answer, but we can talk more too, Tiffany. Thank you.
Hi. Hey. First of all, thank you so much for your responses and for my predecessor's questions. I'm so grateful to be here. My name is Daniella Jimenez, and I'm an educator for the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And I work with undocumented, unaccompanied minors, and I feel like I work for the man, but not only do I work for the man, I teach for the man. So I'm an educational assistant in a school that is essentially for incarcerated young men who get picked up along the border by ICE. And they come from all over parts of Mexico. And what advice, I suppose, would you or anybody give to somebody who feels like they're part of this historical trajectory of being the educator of the oppressor, but also being the educator, being the liberator, being like part of both spheres at once? How how do you fit within the structure and also teach them to subvert it at the same time, you know?
Well, why do you do the work?
Because I'm bilingual.
Well,
because
there's a lot of work you could do.
because I'm Mexican. Like, I grew up in a Mexican household. My mother's Mexican, my father's Mexican and Cuban. Like, I grew up visiting my family in Mexico City, and I have so much empathy for these people and these children. They're children, but they're 17. They're teenage boys. So, yeah, I don't know if what. School is so stifling and school is where that process of being integrated in the grid begins, and being tracked and being monitored and being taught to behave a certain way and be a certain way, and
Yeah.
So how do we teach freedom within that structure, within that, we have to work within the structures that we have, especially in where we are, because we're a secure shelter. So sorry for all the details, but it's definitely that border between incarceration and freedom that can coexist amazingly enough within a school. So.
Yeah, I mean that it coexists, as you said, in every school, right? Incarceration and freedom, by and large, especially for communities of color, right? That oftentimes schools and communities of color look more like prisons than institutions we imagine education happening. I think that's the reality is these institutions shape every single one of our lives, right? And we have to interact with them every single day. And so I think part of it is doing what you're doing about being really honest about the institution that you're inside of, and the limitations of that, and then looking for the openings and the opportunities as well. And so, I think, whether it's a nonprofit, whether or not it's academia, whether or not it's within these more blatantly repressive organizations like the prison system or related pieces of it, just being clear about those limitations, and then, as you said, trying to find those ways to subvert it, to honor and respect and celebrate the humanity of folks, the brilliance of folks, right? I think one of the things that's really important is recognizing that folks who have lived through these experiences are experts, right? Experts in a way that, a scholar who has studied this for 50 years will never be an expert, right? The work that I do around prisons, you can study prisons all day long, but until you know what it's like to have to walk through that gate and leave your loved one inside this hell, you are not an expert in that way. And so I think it's important to recognize and to try and create kind of, like you said, little liberated spaces as much as possible where folks can really shift these paradigms that we're given, right? These like hierarchies that we're given, and saying, what brilliance can you, do you have brilliance? So what brilliance are you bringing to this space? I do work at a youth prison as well with the African American group. And I started out, the first few weeks that I did it, I was like, this is what we're going to talk about. And I was like, I'm trying to make it engaging and like more of a conversation. And they were participating. And after a few weeks, I was like, so what do y'all want to, what do you want to do? And they were like, so no offense, miss, to what you've been doing. It's great and all, but we would actually like to not just focus on institutionalized oppression, but we would like to see the ways that Black folks have resisted. We like to actually have something to be proud of. And I was like, damn. Educator fail. But I think that unfortunately that's what happens a lot of times, is like we want people to be so clear about these institutions, about oppression and how it functions and how it's shaping people's lives. But the lens that we do it is like, look at all these terrible things that have been happening for hundreds of years. Yeah, some people resisted, but it's so terrible. And I feel like I've learned so much trying to shift that and say, let's actually start with, wow, these folks who are just like you were doing amazing work and building amazing institutions, coming up with brilliant ideas and innovations in response to this horrific oppression, centering the resistance rather than centering the oppression. And it's been something that's challenging for me. And I feel like they keep me honest, and they're like, so I thought we were talking about like positive stuff. You just been talking about the prison industrial complex for like 20 minutes straight. I'm like, my bad. Sorry, y'all. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I
thank
really
you.
appreciate
Thanks
it.
for the work that you do.
Thank you for the work that you do.
Hi, Walidah. My name is Dana, and I'm so happy to be here. I saw you the first time at Angela's Davis event at PSU, and I've heard about you before that from friends. And up to 2 weeks ago, I was a graduate assistant and a graduate student at PSU. I studied conflict resolution, and I studied women, gender, and sexuality at PSU. But I'm also from Damascus, Syria, so I'm Middle Eastern originally. And I just became the new president of the PSU student government. So, and my vice president is Latino, and we're very excited. Thank you. If anyone knows here about the PSU. So my question is really comes up from the idea you were talking about assimilation and assimilating and integrating and standing on your own, believing in your own things, but also becoming all of a sudden part of the structure. You have your passions, but also like, now that I'm getting all the emails about like meetings and meeting all the higher ups in the administration and stuff like that, I'm like, well, that was not the work that I was doing before. Like I was, I have a scholarly passion for feminism and transnational feminism and, anti-militarization, and I want to talk about the issues of like arming the police on campus and all of these issues, and it's relating to the people of color and, all of that. But then how can we do the work as activists when we are trying to do it in a way that's empowering? Because the minute I decided to become the president, all the women on the slate, and mostly women of color, and it's the most slate with women, decided to run for senators and all the SFCs, and it's usually women do not run in politics, and women of color are underrepresented in politics. So I feel like it's empowering to have a role model, but it's also frightening, honestly. First of all, I'm frightened of failing, those people and what I'm passionate about. But second of all is like, how do I keep the balance of staying who I want to be, true to my identity, but also trying to speak, be the voice where in my position that I'm in now. So as part of you being in the academia, I don't know if you have an insight to that, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can only give my answer. I think, again, rather than saying there's one right way, I think that there, are as many ways to, move through this as, there are human minds that can think them up. But I think that it really is about holding on to the principles, values, and the integrity that you have, and recognizing that you may have to make really difficult decisions. You may have to stand up and say things no one wants to hear, and you may be the only person standing up and saying them. You may lose out on opportunities. You may have to deal with severe repercussions. And so I think it's about finding that balance between, going out and looking for things to fight, because you don't need to look for them, they're gonna come to you, right?
Right.
But really saying, there are lines that I can't cross, and now you've crossed these lines, and we need to have a conversation about that, right? And if necessary, I need to take actions to make sure that my integrity and my accountability and connection to the communities that I support and who support me is maintained. I think it's really about saying, I think that unfortunately a lot of times folks get access and very slowly they're kind of inculcated into the system, and their loyalties become institutional loyalties rather than the loyalties to the communities that they originally got in those positions to support, and also the communities that did the hard work on the ground of getting them into that position, right? And so I think it's really incumbent to do that, and I think to constantly be questioning yourself, to constantly be questioning power and how it's held and how it's distributed, and trying to disperse that as much as possible, and be willing to be held accountable by folks. And that sucks. Like having people, come to you and be like, I don't know what you were doing in that meeting, but you did not say the things that needed to be said. Where were you? You said you were gonna do X, Y, and Z. You didn't do it, right? Yeah. You were having tea with, the president. What were you doing, right? I mean, and to take that and to, and I think that's one of the hardest things is to be held accountable without defensiveness, without, excuses. To really sit with it and be like, you know what, you're absolutely right, and you are absolutely right to hold me accountable. But I think that is the height of what love and respect look like, is accountability, loving accountability with one another. And if we can't do that, then we can't build new worlds.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Walidah. I'm Katie. First, I can't remember the name that you gave to the subgenre that her type of fiction is.
Visionary fiction.
Visionary fiction. So I was an English major, and I love sci-fi, so my question is kind of weird, but you said that like white folks tend to have like a post-racial fantasy, and that's misguided or not constructive or something. I'm struggling to understand exactly how that is different than like, utopian sci-fi fantasies of how are those two things different, or how are they at odds with each other?
So I don't, for our project, so visionary fiction, our definition of it is fantastical fiction that enables us in questioning existing power inequalities and dynamics, and allows us to help envision new just worlds and begin building them. That's the definition we came up with for visionary fiction. We came up with the term to differentiate visionary fiction from kind of the mainstream sci-fi blockbuster movies of like the white dude who blows everything up, right? And then that's how we win. We were like, so no to that. And we also came up with visionary fiction because we didn't want to argue with our beautiful nerds about whether something had enough scientific basis to be science fiction, or if it was speculative fiction, or actual alternative timeline. We're like, we love you so much, please stop doing that. So we came up with the term visionary fiction. So that's kind of what we're engaging in. And there are several principles of visionary fiction. Adrienne actually writes about them in her outro to the book. But visionary fiction, one of our main principles is that it's conscious of identity. It's conscious of intersecting identities. It centers those folks who are marginalized. So the concept that, we are somehow, or ever will be post-race is, I think, both entirely inaccurate, supports existing white supremacist structures, and to me is actually, sounds pretty horrific. Because I don't actually want to be beyond my race. I am very proud of who I am. I'm very proud of the history and the legacy that I come from. And so I don't want to move beyond that. I don't want that to not be part of who I am. What I don't want is for there to be, societal structures based on identity that constrict, confine, and often decide who lives and who dies. And so I think that what white folks often want to do is say we're post-race so they don't have to deal with racism. It's a fantasy. And oftentimes they create these worlds that are supposedly post-race, but are actually, the vast majority of them, white, right? Like, I mean, the whole upsurge around Hunger Games and Rue, right? The character who was in the book was black, and then in the film they made her black, and white folks were like, can't be Rue because I loved Rue and I don't love no black girls, right? I think that we actually have to take a step back. There's a deeper issue at work here, and Nnedi Okorafor, who's an incredible Nigerian-American science fiction writer, she's brilliant. She talked about this at a panel we were at, Astro Blackness 2, because she was like, yeah, I don't like when white sci-fi writers just describe the color of someone's skin and that's it. And that's how they show brown people made it to the future, right? She's like, so you describe it once, right? And you describe it as dusky, which I don't even know what that means. You are still centralizing whiteness, right? Whiteness is completely centralized. You just have these little pockets of duskiness, whatever that means. And it has no, context, history, or engagement with the history of folks of color. And I think that she made a great point where Nettie said, you know, I am not just my color. My race is not just about my color. It's about my culture. It's about my history. It's about my community, my family, this legacy, my stories. And if you're not encompassing those, then don't just throw us in so you can say, as a white sci-fi writer, no, I'm not racist. I had characters of color.
Yes.
But you can write them in a way that white folks can just imagine that they're white, right? It's like the best of both worlds. Well, you know, you could just skip over the dusky and we're cool, we're good, right? And so I think that in many ways, to me, that's like the epitome of this post-racial fantasy, which is this idea of, you know, often tokenism that is really about maintaining white supremacy. And that white supremacy, again, is literally killing people of color every single day. This is not an abstract conversation or idea. It's not something, you know, that's, oh, isn't this interesting tea talk? Like, this is life and death every day. And that's why, you know, I think pretending that we're post-race is, in many ways, the most you know, brutal form of white supremacy that's happening right now, because it denies even people's experiences. So.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jana Gregory. As I was listening to you speak, I was asking myself, where are places that I could or should be opening these courageous conversations about race? And I know that in the last years that I taught, that was happening at the high school I taught at. And I'm thinking about, you know, church is a good place. My friends love to talk about politics, and almost every issue touches on oppression of one kind or another. I also heard you say, you know, you're organizing kind of as a community, and I think it's really important for people to be in community and have support and strength. But what I didn't hear you say, and my question is whether you don't value the one-to-one friendships and contact between people that are different, either in ethnicity, religion, race, or whatever. Because my experience is that what changes people's hearts are having actual contact with people who are not just like them and who hear their stories. And I don't think that's just because I have a mixed race child, a mixed race daughter-in-law, and a Mexican daughter-in-law. I think that the changes in what has happened in this last few years with regard to gay rights has to do with people coming out and other people saying, oh my gosh, I didn't know that person was A, B, C, D. I mean, I love that person. This is not right. And so, I mean, you know, we shouldn't just change because it's people that we are in contact with, but that's certainly, from my perspective, a way into these issues. And so my question to you is your perception or your opinion that this one-to-one contact between people is not valuable? I went to a couple of race talks.
So I want to answer that, your question. So, I mean, I definitely, I mean, the foundation of visionary fiction, and I think one of the principles that Octavia Butler embodies incredibly well, is the idea of relationship, right? Of being in relationship with one another. That at its core, if a society is not focused on human interactions and relationships, then it is ultimately an unhealthy society, right? And this society is not focused on human interactions and relationships at its core. And at its core, right, capitalism is focused on money. And so this is a deeply problematic thing for folks who want to focus on humans. I mean, I think that, again, what I talked about before is that I think, unfortunately, what happens in those situations is that that folks of color or the oppressed groups are the ones who are having to do the work, right? Or having to explain their existence and defend their existence and their identities to folks who haven't taken the time to do their own educational work. And so I think that it's really about saying, also, what kind of world do I want to live in? And what kind of person do I want to be in that world? So I think that unfortunately a lot of times, again, that savior mentality comes from folks in dominant groups saying, well, you're oppressed, I'm gonna help you, rather than saying, actually living in this oppressive system is damaging me. Not like it's damaging oppressed folks, let's be clear, but it is damaging me. I am not the person I want to be in this system. I am not living the life I want to live, and this is not the world that I want to be supporting. And I think that until folks are recognizing that it's about their personal investment as well, rather than just saying, this is something that I'm doing for someone else, I think that unfortunately those one-on-one interactions too often become, again, the dominant culture person being, getting all of this information and then deciding whether or not they'll even listen to it or take it. And instead of saying, I'm gonna, invest in my own time on my own journey to make sure that I'm engaging on this deeply. So I think it is incumbent on folks who have power and privilege in this society to do their work and to not try and replace doing your work with relationships that make you feel good, but at the end of the day are not fundamentally shifting the way that power happens in this society.
I heard.
So we actually have some other folks who are waiting as well.
I will just say this. I heard you loud and clear, and I think that I'm fairly cognizant of the ways that I wish this land worked, because I have people that are very close to me who, and that affects me and everyone around me. And I believe that cultural diversity is enriching to everybody. And so I don't leave it just to race.
Right.
But I just didn't hear you say at all anything about one-to-one relationships, and that's, I'm not saying,
I don't know how you build community without one-to-one relationships.
but
though.
I didn't hear you talk about relationships between the white and the black community. That was my question.
Thank you for clarifying your question.
Hi, my name is Emma. Thank you for your talk tonight. I'm new to your work, but I'm really excited about it. My question is sort of about Oregon, and when we began the night talking about the identity and the history of Oregon and Oregonians who are here now and who have been here before, and that maybe we sort of delude ourselves with the stories we tell ourselves about what Oregon is in this progressive place, and everybody's welcome, but not everybody. Right. So I'm wondering if you can talk at all about how we might take those narratives, whether it's about environmentalism, local food, biking, those things that are sort of the hallmarks of Oregon, and can make sure that they are inclusive to all Oregonians.
I appreciate the question. I think the idea of kind of inclusivity to me is also in some ways like diversity, because it sort of leaves the center as it is, right? It's in many ways it's about including, right? Inclusivity, including diversity, adding more. Can we get some more color on this plate, right? But the center is still the dominant culture. And so I don't actually even use the term diversity, because honestly I have no idea what it means. And I think, in Portland I've heard it mean everything from race to religion to people who bike to people with purple hair. Honestly, we're so proud of our diversity. I'm like, I don't, and there's an amazing local organizer, Ajamu Umi, who says that, when you talk about diversity, you end up talking about everything, but really not having to talk about anything. And I was like, word. So, what I prefer to talk about is justice, right? Because I think what is, yay, justice! I think what is useful about justice as well is justice happens whether or not there are folks of oppressed groups there, right? Because I think a lot of times what happens is when there are all white spaces, all white groups, all white conversations, all white cities, they're like, well, how do we add diversity? How do we get people to come here, rather than saying, what about this place makes it fundamentally unjust to folks of color, and how do we begin to shift and change that? Our responsibility to build just communities and just societies, and that work can happen, without folks of color having to come in and, like Tiffany talked about before, be the ones bearing the brunt of this, this so-called diversity. And so, I think, I know it's not exactly answering your question, but I think what's incredibly important is recognizing that everything that we love about Portland is rooted in the concept of Oregon being a racist white utopia. That Portland would not be the city it was without the hoarding of resources away from communities of color and holding them entirely for white folks, right? That we wouldn't have these bike lanes and this, sustainable planning and all of these things that make Portland so great if Portland from the very beginning had talked about being a place of justice. And so this history is not something that's long and past. And so we have to recognize that until we dig out that institutionalized oppression that is the foundation of Oregon, and I believe the foundation of this nation, we can't move past that history, right? We can't begin to change the ways that is functioning in the everyday, and we end up with situations like we talked about before, where Portland is unlivable for people of color, for poor folks, for single moms. You just can't afford to live here, and that is a continuation through a different method of the ideology of being a racist white utopia. So, didn't actually answer your question, but
I think we have 3 more.
I'll be super fast.
3 more short questions. Sure. Why don't we do these last 3 questions, and then we'll encourage you to stay here and keep talking, but won't use microphones anymore. Yeah.
And I'll try and keep my responses to like maybe 50 words or less.
Hello, my name is Margaret Ann, and it is a pleasure seeing you up there and inspiring.
Thank you for coming.
All right. I consider myself a community organizer. I totally believe in inclusion and have been trying to, with other people, other supports, have been trying to bring us together. Mm-hmm. What I wanted to ask you is, recently there was the Waco incident where there were 9 people killed. I watched, there was this picture on CNN. None of the men were in handcuffs. None of the men were being arrested. They were sitting. Some of the men were using their cell phones. Mm-hmm. And as a Black woman, Black mother, Black grandmother, who has to be afraid for her Black sons and grandsons, I looked at that picture and I thought, what is this? Mm-hmm. Is this privilege? Is this the white privilege they talked about? Because it sure was different. Had those men been Black, I could see a definite different scenario. Mm-hmm. So what do you think?
It was sort of that was like a lob. It was a softball. I agree with you. And I think this is part of why the work that I do around, I started organizing around prisons while I was still in high school, and then it became part of my scholarly work as well. And, the past maybe 10 years, I focused to shifting and looking at alternatives to incarceration, because through the work that I'm doing and through the work that other scholars that I've mentioned and many more have done, recognizing that the root of policing, the root of prisons is rooted in the control, containment, and exploitation of potentially rebellious communities, specifically people of color, right? And specifically the Black community. Christian Williams, who's actually a local author, wrote a book called Our Enemies in Blue, A History of Modern Policing in America, I think Policing and Power in America. And he shows that the modern formation of police is from slave patrols. That when you look back and you say what institutions at that time had the same structures, makeup, and formation as police, who were the progenitors of police, he shows that it was the city guard, which was the urban slave patrols, right? So if the foundation of policing was not about keeping our communities safe, but about patrolling, controlling, containing, and exploiting Black folks specifically and other, oppressed groups, then how do we expect that this system will operate differently, right? And, in the same way that Ursula Le Guin talked about, the divine right of kings and how folks couldn't imagine anything else, I think that oftentimes people will say, yes, policing isn't working the way we thought it was, especially looking at, the incredible organizing work of Black Lives Matters and allies happening around the world. But folks say, well, that's all we have. And I think that it's incredibly important to say that's not, the modern institution of policing is actually very relatively new. And there are many examples of other ways that communities keep themselves safe from harm. I mean, Rolling Stone even ran an article that was like, policing's a dirty job and no one's got to do it. And I was like, Rolling Stone, what? I think that, I think it's important for us, and I think this is part of why science fiction has been such an important place for me, because oftentimes when I've said, well, let's imagine a world without police, people are like, what is wrong with you, right? What kind of, I actually had an organizer say, did you ride in on a rainbow on a unicorn? Like, that's not ever gonna happen. And I think if you say, okay, let's imagine this other planet where the police never developed and instead folks developed community strategies for keeping each other safe, folks will go, okay, and what happens next? You're like, really? You're going along with this? But so I think it's incredibly important to recognize the foundation of these institutions is absolutely rooted in white supremacy, like you said. And I think, there are many people working on many different levels, and I think that's incredibly important. To me, a movement is a formation that has many strategies, tactics, folks engaging in different ways. But for me, my goal is to say, what else is possible? How could we imagine our lives being completely different rather than just saying, how can we make a kinder, gentler slavery, right? How can we actually imagine not just an end to legal slavery, but that abolition democracy, that true liberation that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, right? And I think the other piece that's just really important as well to know is to recognize, I love the concept of the term Black Lives Matters, and I think it's incredibly important to recognize that when we're talking about state violence, that Black women and Black trans folks actually disproportionately experience assault and violence and murder at the hands of police, that they are absolutely victims and survivors of police violence. And so my hope is that when we say Black Lives Matter, we don't actually just mean Black male lives around these issues, but we mean Black Lives Matter, period.
You had
Thank
talked
you so
about
much.
being hopeful.
I'm sorry.
There's one more thing. You had talked about being hopeful. Where I can be hopeful is there are a lot of white, the people that surround me or in my life, who are bringing this up to me. They're white people saying, hey, look at this. This isn't right. And that is why I'm hopeful, because they're recognizing that.
Thank you. And that was not 50 words. I know it wasn't.
I'm Dana, and I'm white.
It's like AA.
Right. Exactly. So I've been thinking about the role, just thinking about criminal justice system and conversation and action, and thinking about my role as a white ally in terms of criminal justice and the value of witnessing. I'm just tonight kind of making a connection with that, with the conversation, because I feel like as a white ally, I've been working with some of my friends over here, looking at equity in education, and I think engaging white people is about the conversation, and in a way that slows it down potentially to be witnessed, to allow action to happen, not driven by us. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question to you would be around conversation versus action, and who needs to be conversing and who needs to be acting, I guess.
I mean, I think that's a yes and, right? I mean, it's certainly not one or the other, that they're intrinsically tied together. So I feel like, I mean, we've touched some about that in this space around how conversations happen and responsibilities. And I think, again, it's really about holding ourselves accountable for, embodying the justice in the worlds that we want to see. And so attempting to put in the work and the effort to manifest that in our personal actions as well as within the larger society. And when we aren't able to do that, because we won't, right? Because we will mess up, because every single person in here will mess up. I've probably messed up like 8 times today already. Being willing to be held accountable for that, and being appreciative that folks are willing to invest the energy to hold folks accountable. I think that's the other thing that people don't recognize. The amount of energy it takes to hold someone accountable is a lot, right? And the fact that people invest that actually means that they think, there's the potential for something to come out of that, which I think is a more useful frame than, oh, you just told me I'm the most terrible human being that's ever walked the face of the earth, and I'm going to just go eat some ice cream and hang out.
Well, I think the piece is, knowing what my training was as a white liberal was about that I was supposed to lead. I was supposed to make decisions. I was supposed to manage. And I've stepped back maybe to the detriment of actually acting over time. But I think it feels like the conversation, like actually stepping back and having the conversation about look what's really in front of us and look who really is leading and look what that leadership looks like, feels like a necessary part of taking action, kind of by sitting back a little bit. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, I think yes, no to white folks leading everything. So that's great. But I think, again, that sometimes fear or guilt paralyzes folks. And I think that, again, you need to be doing your work. You need to be educating yourself. You need to be engaging as much as you can. But, action needs to happen. And then when you do action and when you mess up, be excited to be held accountable and to work to be better, right? I think that unfortunately I've seen a lot of folks when they get held accountable, when they're like, I'm so excited, and then people are like, oh boo, what you were doing? No, right? That folks are like, okay, well, I'm not gonna do anything ever again then because I don't wanna mess up. And I think that is, I think, again, it's a very Western way of thinking, right? Rather than saying, wow, what an amazing opportunity that was, and thank you for investing the time and energy to tell me about that, and I'm excited to go away and think about how I can integrate this into my future work. So I don't know if that actually answered anything, but yeah.
Well, first and foremost, thanks for coming out this evening. I really enjoyed everyone's questions and everything everyone's had to say. I work in human resources for a tech company here in Portland. I won't mention their name because, Portland's small world. But this week, we got the quote-unquote diversity bug going around the office, where I was doing a debrief for an interview Monday, and the conversation came up from the vice president of the company about, we need to get more diverse here. We need to find out why we're not getting more diverse applicants. Like, we need more women in the office and more people of different races in the office. I'm sitting at the time I'm sitting in a room with 6 other white men. The vice president's a British white guy. No one says anything to me. I'm the head of recruiting for HR. Mm-hmm. No one says anything like, Farrell, any ideas? So I let it go. I was kind of annoyed, but I let it go. It's just like, we need to look into that. So I was like, okay, well, we'll make a meeting for next week and we'll sit down with the managers and we'll have a conversation about it. Today, before I leave, the head of HR, the person that I work under, she comes to me. She wants me to research ways to get diverse talent to work for our company. Once again, I'm the black guy sitting in the room right in front of her who runs the recruiting, and no one's asking me, hey, Frau, you have any ideas how we can get some other people in the office? And I find myself wondering, how racist is that? You know?
On the racist Richter scale, you mean?
Yes, on the scale of 1 to 10.
We need a racist seismograph to be like, no, that was a big one, y'all. That was a...
Like, how are you not asking the head of your recruiting, who's a black guy, nothing about inclusion or anything at all?
Right.
When I was interviewed for this position, and I was given this position, that was a big talking point that we brought up. Yeah, somehow we're doing all this diversity talk and no one's even breached. Hey, Farrell might have an idea or two.
Right.
So my question is, I'm gonna have to breach this subject at some point. I'm gonna have to just jump in and state, hey, I have some ideas. How do I go about that?
I'm like, I feel like this might be something. I was like, this feels like a life coach area. I was like, I don't know. I have a poetry group and it's called Good Sister, Bad Sister, and I'm the bad sister, so I kind of wish my good sister was here because she's the one who's like, well, you know, I'm really excited about your enthusiasm and I'd love to give you some ideas on different ways to think about that, whereas I'm like, look, right? I don't know if it's a look kind of conversation or not. But I mean, I think you being clear and if you feel comfortable naming what's happening. I mean, I also think it's important to recognize they may not be asking you because they may not actually want to hear what you have to say, and they may not actually want to have to do anything, right?
I thought of that. Like,
I mean, this is actually kind of like my mom. Like, she will tell you, she doesn't ever give her opinion on anything, but if you ask her, she will just say it so bluntly that it leaves razor burn. So I've learned, not to ask if I'm not ready to hear what mama has to say. So they're like, we don't want to actually have to hear what you have to say because we're not actually going to make any changes that you suggest. We just want to have this conversation and feel good about it, right? So I'm like, that's a terrible place to end, but but I'm going to be looking for that racism seismograph because I think it'd be going off a lot. So thank you.
So before formally concluding, I want to encourage a couple things. First, Walidah's books are out that way. So Scars and Stars, Book of Poetry, Octavia's Brood, which is only available here and in Walidah's car right now because it's sold out everywhere else, at least for the moment.
Yeah, that was amazing. No, I've never.
So
it's just in my car.
Right.
Yes.
So the books are in back. I also would just really encourage you to continue to hang out here this evening and keep talking, or find those other places to keep talking, however complex the relationship between conversation and action may be. We hope that you will keep talking and keep listening. And what I want to say, I guess, as a last word for me is just real gratitude to all of you for being here, and to Walidah. And the phrase that keeps coming up for me is around holding ourselves accountable. And I think you've done so much, even in a short time this evening, and especially with the way you are working in the world to help us hold ourselves accountable. And I just want to say a big thanks for all the ways you do that. So thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for coming to listen to me nerd out and talk and rant sometimes. And I'm happy to sign folks' books if you are interested. And I'm just really thankful to Adam and to Oregon Humanities for inviting me into this space and getting to hang out with all of you. And I look forward to talking to some of you, maybe not every single one of you in more depth in a few minutes.
So thanks so much.